The millennial generation, that's my generation, has no aspirations to buy real estate. At least that's what Gary Berman says. He's CEO of Toronto's prominent residential corporation, Tycoon Residential. This multi-billion-dollar company has become one of the largest owners of single-family homes in the United States. With inflation on the rise across the country, Berman says more people, particularly millennials, are renting. According to CBS News, Berman said, quote, "Millennials aren't living in their parents' basement anymore or shacking up with roommates. They want a place of their own, and we didn't build any housing for them in the last decade because we're still so traumatized by the last housing crisis," end quote.
Berman also said millennials care more about, quote, lifestyle than necessarily the desire to buy a home. Let's take a look.
I think if you asked a lot of millennials, and that tends to be our primary resident, they would probably tell you that they don't necessarily desire to own a home or to own a car. And they've grown up in the sharing economy, and for what's important to them is lifestyle, right? And so if they can move into this, what we call a turnkey or hotel-ready home, and have a low-maintenance lifestyle, that's very compelling for them.
Alencia Johnson joins us now to weigh in. She's a Democratic strategist and Chief Impact Officer at 1063 West Broad. Welcome, Alencia.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So it reminds me of that line that people quote from the Great Reset thing. You'll own nothing and you'll love it. Is there anything to this? Is he right that millennials, they're like, we'll just take a pass on this whole American dream home ownership thing?
I don't know if you caught my face before I came on, but I was very concerned about his comments. They came across very patronizing. I am an older millennial who does not own, and that's not because I don't want to, but his reasoning for millennials not owning is actually wrong. Part of the reason that a lot of millennials don't own is because we are crushing with student loan debt, and we need to cancel student loan debt. We have, our salaries are not matching these rent and mortgage prices. We are unable to save in the way that our parents' generations were. And so I don't believe it's necessarily just because millennials don't want to own a home. It's because we literally cannot. It is hard for someone to save to buy a home when more than 50% of your income tends to go to renting. And so I would take a different approach than the CEO, but it's obvious, as he is not even he owns a company from Canada, and unfortunately is buying up homes in the United States, actually adding to the problem, not helping solve the problems for millennials. So I found his assessment very patronizing and missing the mark completely.
I mean, I think I disagree. I actually agreed substantially with the analysis. I think it describes some, not all millennials. I think it describes some millennials who for whom experience does matter, who want to live in a place that is difficult to afford, like New York or LA or Washington, D.C., because they want a professional, social community. And if you're going to choose to live in those places, yes, it is difficult to afford a home, but home ownership is affordable even for millennials if they're willing to look outside the core big city liberal elite lifestyle. It is affordable, don't you think?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily call it a liberal elite lifestyle. I've lived in these major cities that you've talked about, and there's people from different ideologies. The reality is, to your point, yes, there are homes that are affordable in smaller towns, such as or cities like a Durham or a Charlotte or some of those smaller cities. But the jobs with the salaries that are comparable to the ones in the Washington, D.C.s and the San Franciscos are also not there. And so it's very compounded. And I will say that, yes, millennials are in their 30s, maybe early 40s, and not necessarily having a large family, but eventually the conversation becomes, what am I going to do if I get married, I have children, I want more land, I also want to build wealth. If we think about it, millennials are diverse, and unfortunately for a lot of millennials of color, that is one way for us to actually achieve wealth. And so it's a very compounded analysis. And yes, I lived in a big city, as I've mentioned, and to your point of people wanting to be transient, wanting to live in New York, wanting to live in Chicago, absolutely. But at a certain point, the lifestyle changes, and we're having this conversation of what are the big investments going to be in order to build wealth and generate wealth, create a family, and have more space.
And among your social set, what are you finding as people transition kind of out of their 20s? Because like, sure, you could look at any generation that's when they move to a major city, they're gonna rent, they're gonna shack up with roommates. The ones who have parents who live in the city are gonna maybe live in their basement. Like that's very normal. But then as they put some money together, and as they then move into creating a family and moving on to the next phase of their life, then they buy something and they kind of settle down, quote unquote. That's the part that doesn't exist for millennials. And so how are you seeing the transition play out among your circle?
Well, I think with the pandemic, it has actually exacerbated this conversation, and people are thinking, okay, where can I, especially with the ability to work from home, where can I set up somewhere and actually build a lifestyle for several years? I don't want this fast-paced lifestyle anymore. I kind of want to take roots somewhere and build a community. Millennials love a community, and that looks differently, whether it's with your family, with your friends, with your social circle, your work network, whatever it may be. And so I'm in a lot of conversation of people in their mid to late 30s trying to figure out where can we afford the quality of life that we love, with great restaurants, with very walkable towns, and I can also have space and I can build wealth by building a home. And so this conversation is shifting, and it's not just this turning over, going from apartment to apartment, city to city. Folks want to take roots somewhere, and I think the pandemic has really pushed that conversation forward.
Well, according to Berman, the company's revenue increased by 67% last year, and 60 Minutes journalist Leslie Stahl says Tycoon, which currently has about 30,000 rental homes across the U.S., is trying to buy 800 houses a month. People all over the United States and Canada are angry about those comments and his suggestion that, quote, home ownership isn't something millennials desire, end quote. I mean, they can be mad about it. Again, I think some millennials do value the experience over narrow, you have to own a home. Owning a home can be a hassle too. It can be something you just sink money into. They having to repair everything, having to worry about everything. But maybe that's just my view. I don't know. Maybe I fall into the category of millennials who are not overly obsessed with home ownership.
Well, to that point, there's nuance here. A lot of things can be true at the same time. Home ownership does come with a whole lot of responsibility. And so as we're having this conversation about home ownership and it's shifting for millennials, we should just talk about how are millennials building wealth in other ways, right? The conversation of home ownership has always been around building generational wealth. And so what are the other ways in which millennials are making investments when you have landlords like this hoarding rental properties and raising prices? I mean, I believe this article was talking about how rental prices have gone up almost 30%, which is just straight greedy. We are still in a pandemic and we are still in economic recovery. And so if we're going to have this conversation about the shifting ideology around home ownership, let's also have this conversation about other ways in which millennials are trying to invest and build wealth. And that might not be ownership. Let's
have a conversation about building more houses. I mean, that's the problem. There's an artificial constraint on the supply of housing because it's so difficult to build and develop anywhere. And we're not building so that's a check on home ownership that, yes, I think is a problem and that I'm in favor of fixing.
And ban this Canadian from buying them all up. But yes. build more, ban private equity from buying them. Yeah. Problem won't be solved, but you'll get a lot of the way there, right?
I agree. I do not think a Canadian should be coming in the United States when we have a housing issue that we need to resolve on our own. And he's buying all of them up as well. I absolutely agree with you on that point.
Yeah, thumbs down on that. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And we will have more Rising right after this.